The evaluation form had 47 fields, and Counselor Tesek Oryavan had filled in 46 of them before the shuttle even docked. Species of origin, Terran human. Medium classification, unregistered. Structural permanence index, pending assumed negligible. Chromatic range, likely substandard. Institutional backing, none found in any recognized archive. Harmonic resonance profile, none submitted. Electromagnetic interaction coefficient, none submitted. Gravitational manipulation index, not applicable. Computational design methodology, none submitted. The 47th field overall cultural merit assessment remained blank, but only because protocol demanded he view the work before scoring it. Protocol, not necessity. Tesek tilted his crystalline head and reviewed the docking manifest on his data slab. The shuttle approaching Bay 11 carried a single human and approximately 1,400 kilograms of cargo. The cargo manifest listed the contents as mixed media installation, fragile, climate-controlled. No material breakdown, no spectral composition data, no harmonic resonance profile, no degradation timeline, no computational modeling documentation. The kind of submission form that would have been rejected outright from any civilization with a functioning arts ministry. He set the slab down and allowed himself a small harmonic, a faint ringing through his crystalline facets, that the Vetraxi used the way other species used a cleared throat. The conclave of aesthetic evaluation had 7 submissions this cycle, and each of the other 6 had arrived with documentation packages running to hundreds of pages. Station 6, beside his own, held a submission from the Dreenath Collective, a gravitational wave synthesizer that had taken 40 years to compose and required a custom-built orbital resonance chamber to experience. Its documentation package was 1,100 pages. Station 4 held the Kellish biological tapestry, a living organism engineered to grow in patterns that expressed the mathematical structure of its home star's radiation spectrum. 800 pages. Station 2 held a Velisi bioluminescent opera that communicated emotion through synchronized photon cascades across 4,000 discrete membrane cells. 914 pages, plus a spectral calibration appendix. Station 7 held a human with some rocks and plant fiber, and 1 page. The conclave convened once every 6 cycles in the orbital gallery above Pele's Major, and it existed for one purpose: to determine which new species, if any, had produced work worthy of inclusion in the permanent collection. The permanent collection was the galaxy's definitive cultural archive, 412 civilizations represented, spanning 11,000 years of verified aesthetic achievement. To earn a place was to be recognized as a civilization capable of beauty. To be denied was to be officially classified as culturally negligible. Most species never applied. Of those that did, roughly 1 in 9 succeeded. The process was rigorous, fair, and Tesek believed with 31 years of conviction behind him complete. Humans had never applied before. Tesek found that detail mildly interesting, the way one might find it interesting that a particular variety of stone had never been catalogued. It did not change his assessment. He had reviewed the preliminary materials the human delegation had submitted, 3 low-resolution images, and a written statement of intent that ran to exactly 1 page. The images showed objects that appeared to be made of plant fiber, mineral powder, and some kind of adhesive animal extract. The statement of intent used the word feeling 4 times and the word beauty 3 times without defining either. It did not use the words spectral, harmonic, resonance, permanence, or computational at all. Tesek had been the conclave's senior evaluator for 31 years. His species, the Vetraxi, perceived light across 940 spectral bands. Their cultural output was mathematically precise, architecturally rigorous, and existed on a scale that required orbital observation platforms to appreciate in full. He had evaluated and rejected submissions from civilizations that built with compressed plasma and wove electromagnetic fields into living sculptures that pulsed with the rhythms of binary star systems. He had rejected a species that composed music using the radiation frequencies of dying stars. He had rejected, 2 cycles ago, a gravitational lensing installation from a species that could bend spacetime itself into aesthetic configurations. A species that used plant fiber and mineral dust was not going to trouble him. He double-checked his preliminary scoring notes. Chromatic range, substandard, material sophistication, primitive, structural permanence, poor. He had pre-drafted the rejection summary during the shuttle's approach. It was concise, fair, and would take less than 3 minutes to finalize once the in-person viewing confirmed what the submission materials already made clear. He had already begun composing, in his mind, the polite letter that would be sent to the Terran diplomatic corps. Thank you for your interest in the conclave's process. The permanent collection welcomes reapplication after a minimum interval of 2 cycles. Perhaps, in the interim, the Terran Arts Ministry might consider investing in spectral engineering consultation. The thought amused him in a mild, professional way. He had been through this before. Every few cycles, a young civilization applied with work that was culturally meaningful to its makers, but quantitatively inadequate by galactic standards. These were not bad submissions. They were simply submissions from species that had not yet developed the perceptual or technological sophistication to produce work at the conclave's level. Tesek treated them with respect. He scored them honestly. He sent them home with constructive guidance. It was the kindest thing the conclave could do. Show them how far they had to go so they could begin the journey. He expected the Terran submission to be exactly this kind of case. A culturally sincere effort from a young species, technically primitive, but perhaps carrying some faint charm of naivety that he would note in his qualitative remarks before filing the rejection. An hour's work at most. He stepped out of the evaluation chamber's anteroom and into the grand atrium, where the conclave's preliminary viewing was underway. The atrium was a marvel of vetraxy, engineering a circular chamber 300 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to 50 meters at its apex, and was embedded with 64,000 individually calibrated photonic emitters. The emitters produced uniform illumination across the full visible spectrum, plus ultraviolet through near-infrared, ensuring that no pigment, no material, no clever manipulation of lighting angles could disguise a work's true chromatic properties. The floor was a single sheet of optically neutral composite, engineered to neither absorb nor reflect any wavelength preferentially. The walls were acoustically tuned to eliminate echo and reverberation, so that sound-based submissions could be evaluated in pure environmental silence. Even the air was controlled, temperature held at a precise galactic standard mean, humidity at levels that would affect no known material, barometric pressure calibrated to the midpoint of all submitted species comfort ranges. It was a room built for judgment, stripped of every variable that might bias an evaluator's perception toward or away from any submission. In 400 years, it had done its job without error, and the conclave was quietly proud of this fact in the way that institutions are proud of the infrastructure they consider too fundamental to mention. 7 evaluators stood at their assigned stations around the circular gallery, each paired with a different submission. The Dreenith submission at Station 6 was already generating a low gravitational hum that Tesek could feel in his lattice structure. Beautiful. The Kellish tapestry at Station 4 was slowly unfurling a new growth pattern, its biological algorithms producing fractal geometries that shifted in real time. Extraordinary. The Velocity Opera at Station 2 was cycling through its opening movement, sheets of coordinated bioluminescence washing across its membrane array in patterns that encoded emotional states no verbal language could express. The atrium hummed with the output of civilizations that had spent decades or centuries refining their submissions. Station 7, at the far end near the environmental controls, was quiet. A pair of gallery technicians, squat, four-armed Bresic with calibrated optical arrays mounted on their harnesses, were unpacking the first crate under the supervision of a human. The human was unremarkable, male, middle-aged by their standards, wearing plain dark clothing that appeared to be woven plant fiber. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. He moved with an unhurried economy that Tesek noted and filed under unsophisticated no-measurement tools. No alignment lasers, no spectral calibrators, no computational modeling interface. The human was arranging objects on the display plinth with his bare hands, adjusting angles by millimeter fractions, stepping back, squinting, adjusting again. He tilted one piece 1/4 of a degree, stepped back 3 paces, tilted it back 1/8 of a degree, and left it. The process appeared to be entirely governed by his biological eyes. Tesek activated his formal evaluation protocol and approached. "I am Counselor Tesek Oryevon, Senior Evaluator of the Conclave of Aesthetic Evaluation," he said, the translation module rendering his harmonic speech into flat Terran syllables. "You are the submitting artist." The human looked up. He had deep lines around his eyes and actual pigmented paste under his fingernails. "Myron Hasek," he said. "Yes. Your submission materials are incomplete. You have provided no spectral composition data, no harmonic resonance profile, no structural permanence index, no material degradation timeline, no computational design documentation, and no electromagnetic interaction specifications. These are standard requirements for formal evaluation. 17 of the 47 evaluation parameters cannot be assessed without them." Hasek wiped his hands on a cloth that was itself streaked with old pigment stains in a dozen colors. "The work is here," he said. "You can look at it." Tesek's facets caught the overhead light and refracted it into a brief cascade of color, the Vetraxy equivalent of a politely suppressed sigh. The evaluation form requires quantitative data across 47 parameters. Visual inspection is only one component. "I understand," Hasek said. He folded the cloth with careful attention as though the cloth itself mattered. "I'll fill in what I can. The rest you'll have to see for yourself." "That is not how the conclave's process works, Mr. Hasek." The human met his gaze with an expression that Tesek's perceptual matrix classified as patient. Not defiant, not nervous, not apologetic, patient, the way a man might wait for weather. "I understand that too," Hasek said. This was going to be simple. Tesek returned to his station and began his formal inspection while the technicians finished unpacking. The installation occupied a space roughly 4 meters by 3, arranged on a low platform the human had brought with him. The platform itself was made of wood, actual dead plant matter, cut and joined with visible handwork joints, the seams tight and clean, but achieved through physical skill rather than molecular bonding or engineered adhesion. Tesek noted the craftsmanship with clinical objectivity. The precision was real, but it was the precision of a carpenter, not an engineer. The Bresic technicians were handling the individual pieces with exaggerated care, their optical arrays pulsing as they scanned each object, and one of them made a small sound, a soft intake of breath through her gill plates that Tesek filed and ignored. The first piece was a flat rectangle approximately 60 centimeters by 90. Tesek recognized the medium from his preliminary review, a woven plant fiber sheet stretched over a rigid frame, coated with layers of pigmented paste ground mineral, primarily suspended in what the submission form called linseed oil, an organic binder derived from a plant seed. The surface was not flat. Under magnification, it was a topography of ridges and valleys where the paste had been applied and layered and scraped back and reapplied, in some areas a dozen times or more. The process appeared to be entirely manual. Tesek could see the marks of individual brush strokes, the texture left by animal hair bristles drawn through viscous pigment by a biological hand. The image depicted an interior space, a room with arched ceilings, ornate columns, a staircase descending into warm amber light. There were figures, small and secondary, moving through the space with a kind of purposeful haste that suggested errand rather than ceremony. The architectural detail was rendered with obsessive care. Each balustrade, each tile pattern, each shadow cast by each column was individually painted, with a patience that bordered on the devotional. The light in the painting came from somewhere to the left and slightly above, casting long shadows that Tessek's 940 spectral bands registered as a complex interplay of warm ochre, cool violet, and a dozen transitional frequencies that had no name in the Vetraxi chromatic lexicon. Tessek paused. This was unusual. The Vetraxi chromatic lexicon contained designations for every color perceivable across 940 bands. It had been developed over 6,000 years and was considered exhaustive. He ran a spectral analysis of the painted shadows. The pigments were simple iron oxide, titanium dioxide, carbon black, various earth minerals ground to powder and suspended in the organic oil medium. Nothing exotic, nothing unprecedented. The chromatic range was limited to the human visible spectrum, roughly 400 to 700 nanometers, a fraction of what Tessek could perceive. A sliver. The structural permanence index was low organic binders, susceptible to oxidation and UV degradation. By Vetraxi standards, this object would begin deteriorating within decades. The Dreenith gravitational composition at Station 6 would outlast the heat death of its host star. He noted all of this on his evaluation form, field after field, substandard, limited, negligible, impermanent. Then he looked at the painting again. The light. He had analyzed the pigments. He knew exactly what minerals produced the warm amber glow that filled the painted room's archway. Iron oxide, titanium white, a trace of cadmium yellow, ordinary materials available on any terrestrial planet with basic mining. But the way they were arranged, the layering, the transparency of thin glazes over opaque grounds, the way the human had manipulated the paint's physical thickness to create variations in how light reflected off the textured surface, produced an effect that Tessek's spectral analysis could not account for. The painted light looked warm. Not warm in the measurable sense. The surface temperature of the painted object was uniform at 18.3 degrees, the emissivity constant across the panel. Warm in some other way that had no place in the evaluation form. The amber glow in the archway created a response in Tessek's perceptual matrix that his formal training had no category for. It was not beauty as the Vetraxi defined it, mathematical harmony, spectral precision, structural resonance across multiple perceptual bands. It was something else entirely. Something that used the limitations of the medium, the narrow spectral range, the crude mineral pigments, the fragile organic binder, the visible marks of the hand that made it as if those limitations were not obstacles but instruments. Tessek moved to the second piece. This one was smaller, perhaps 30 centimeters square, a portrait. A single face, rendered in the same crude pigmented paste on the same woven plant fiber. The face belonged to no species Tessek recognized as aesthetically significant. It was human, with the typical bilateral symmetry, the soft tissue covering, the paired optical organs that perceived a mere 300 nanometers of bandwidth. The expression was difficult to read. The mouth was slightly curved. The eyes held something that Tessek's translation module could not render into Vetraxi concepts, not sadness, not joy, not curiosity, but some compound state that seemed to contain all of these and settle on none. He spent 4 minutes on the portrait and realized he had not touched his evaluation slab. His standard viewing time per piece was 2 minutes. He forced himself to make a note. Extended viewing, cause unclear, likely due to perceptual unfamiliarity with Terran facial representation conventions. The third piece unsettled him further. It was also a portrait, but of a different human, older, with deep creases in the face and a gaze that seemed directed inward rather than outward. The brushwork here was rougher, more visible, the individual strokes thicker and more textured than in the architectural interior. Tesek could see where the artist had loaded the brush with heavy, opaque paint and laid it down in a single decisive motion, and where he had scraped paint away with a flat tool to reveal the layer beneath. The face emerged from these marks the way. A geological formation emerges from erosion, not by adding detail, but by removing everything that was not the essential structure. Tesek made another note. Technique appears deliberately crude in this piece. Possible cultural artifact. Terran aesthetic traditions may value visible evidence of manual process. He paused over what he had written. The note was accurate. It was also, in a way he could not yet articulate, entirely beside the point. The fourth piece broke the pattern entirely. It was three-dimensional, a construction of thin metal wire, colored glass fragments, and what appeared to be paper. Rice paper, the submission form said. It hung from a support frame by a single thread and moved in the faintest air current from the atrium's ventilation system. As it turned, the colored glass caught the room's uniform light and scattered it across the surrounding surfaces in shifting patterns of color and shadow. The patterns were not mathematically regular. They did not repeat. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and governed by forces as trivial as air pressure differentials, and the object's own rotational momentum, and the weight distribution of its asymmetric components. Tesek's facets flared involuntarily. The scattered light played across his crystalline surface, and for a fraction of a second, he perceived his own body as part of the installation, a receiving surface for the human's art, responding to it, changed by it. The sensation passed, but it had happened, and Tesek's 31 years of disciplined evaluation demanded that he note it on his slab. He wrote, involuntary perceptual response, duration, approximately 0.4 seconds, cause, interaction between scattered polychromatic light from mobile sculpture and evaluator's crystalline lattice structure. Note, this interaction was not designed by the artist and cannot be classified as intentional. Then he added, after a pause, though the artist may have anticipated that his work would interact with viewers in ways he could not predict. Whether this constitutes design is a question the evaluator is not equipped to answer. He stepped back. The gallery technicians had stopped their work and were watching him. The nearest Bresic had all four arms folded against her thorax, her optical arrays trained on his crystalline face with the expression of a technical worker watching a senior official encounter something outside protocol. "Is there a problem with the installation?" Tesek asked. "No, counselor. Everything is in order." Tesek returned to his slab. He began entering data into the quantitative fields with precise, methodical strokes, and the numbers he entered were exactly what the materials warranted. Low spectral range, limited chromatic vocabulary, poor structural permanence, no harmonic resonance signature, no electromagnetic interaction design, no gravitational or temporal manipulation. By every measurable standard, the work scored in the lowest decile the conclave had ever recorded. Lower than the Brenny sandstone carvings, lower than the Thule seed pod arrangements, lower, in raw quantitative terms, than the submission from a pre-spaceflight species that the conclave had evaluated as a courtesy 40 years ago and gently rejected. He opened the qualitative assessment section, and his stylus hovered over the slab without making contact. The fifth piece was a landscape, a horizontal panel showing an expanse of open terrain under a sky that shifted from pale yellow near the horizon to deep blue at the zenith. The sky alone occupied 2/3 of the panel. It contained, by spectral measurement, fewer than 20 distinct pigment compounds. It should have been simple, flat, limited. Instead, Tesek found himself perceiving depth in it, layers of atmosphere, the scattering of light through particulate matter, the specific quality of illumination that occurs when a star's light passes through a planet's gaseous envelope at a low angle. He knew the physics of atmospheric scattering intimately. He had designed crystalline installations that replicated it with mathematical precision across 940 bands. None of them had looked like this sky looked. The sixth piece was small a study, the submission form called it. An arrangement of objects on a flat surface, a ceramic vessel, 3 pieces of fruit, a folded cloth. Tessek's analytical matrix classified it as a representation exercise. He was about to move on when he noticed the shadow cast by the ceramic vessel. The shadow was painted in a cool purple blue that did not correspond to any real shadow color Tessek could calculate from the depicted light source. It was wrong. Objectively, measurably wrong. And it made the entire composition feel more real than any optically correct rendering could have achieved. He stood in front of the still life for 3 minutes, trying to understand how an incorrect shadow could produce a more accurate perceptual experience than a correct one. He consulted the spectral data. He cross-referenced the light source angle with the shadow's chromatic values. The discrepancy was clear and deliberate. The artist had chosen a color that was physically impossible in the depicted lighting conditions, and had, by that choice, created something that felt truer than truth. Tessek failed to explain this. He moved on. The seventh piece was a watercolor, a different technique entirely, using water-soluble pigments applied to absorbent paper. The medium was even more impermanent than the oils. A single spill, a careless humidity fluctuation, and the image would bleed into illegibility. It showed a bridge over moving water. The water was suggested rather than rendered a few strokes of diluted blue-gray, some unpainted white space where the paper itself served as the color of reflected sky. The artist had not painted the water. He had painted around the water and allowed the absence of paint to become the river. Tessek ran the arithmetic. The most expensive part of this piece, in material terms, was the paper it was painted on. The most expressive part was the paper he had left unpainted. This was, by the conclave's framework, nonsensical. The framework evaluated what the artist had added. It had no mechanism for evaluating what the artist had deliberately left out. The eighth watercolor showed a human cityscape at dusk, buildings silhouetted against a sky that graduated from pale gold to deep violet through a wash technique, so fluid it was impossible to determine where one color ended and another began. The boundaries were not boundaries. They were transitions. Tessek's spectral analysis identified 12 pigment compounds in the entire piece. 12. The Vélizy Opera at Station 2 used 4,000 discrete bioluminescent cells. Hasek had used 12 dissolved minerals and produced a sky that felt more like actual atmosphere than any of them. The ninth watercolor was the simplest of all, a single leafless tree against a white ground. No background, no context. Just the tree, its branches rendered in 3 or 4 shades of gray-brown, applied with perhaps 20 individual brush strokes. The whole piece could not have taken more than a few minutes to execute. It had the quality of something captured rather than constructed, as if the tree had existed for one moment, and the artist had pinned that moment to the paper before it vanished. Tessek noted in his slab, Piece 9, minimal material expenditure, minimal execution time, minimal chromatic range. Perceptual impact, disproportionately high. Evaluator unable to account for the discrepancy. He was beginning to suspect that the discrepancy was not a flaw in his perception. It was a flaw in the framework. The 10th piece was the largest, and Hasek was still adjusting it when Tessek circled back. It was a panel nearly 2 meters tall, divided into 3 hinged sections that could be opened and closed. A triptych. The exterior, when folded, showed a muted landscape in grays and browns. Unremarkable. Tessek documented it. Then Hasek opened the panels, revealing the interior, and Tessek felt his crystalline structure resonate at a frequency he had never experienced in 31 years of standing before art. The interior depicted a garden. Not a real garden, the proportions were wrong, the perspective deliberately skewed. the colors heightened beyond any photographic accuracy. Trees bore fruit in colors that did not exist in nature, rendered in pigments that could not produce those colors by any spectral measure Tesek could apply. And yet there they were, impossible blues that seemed to recede into actual distance, golds that appeared to emit their own light from within the paint layer, greens so saturated they seemed to pulse with biological energy. The garden was populated with small figures engaged in activities that Tesek's cultural database could not fully parse: eating, talking, playing instruments, reading, laughing, weeping, sleeping in the shade of the impossible trees. One figure stood apart from the others, near the right edge of the central panel, looking directly out of the painting and at the viewer. At Tesek, the painted eyes held the same unnameable quality as the portraits, but amplified by the garden's luminous unreality. The figure was not doing anything remarkable, it was simply present. And it held Tesek's gaze with a force that no spectral analysis could quantify, and no evaluation form could score. He stood in front of the triptych for 11 minutes. The evaluation timer beeped twice. He silenced it without looking. The 11th piece was a ceramic vessel stoneware, fired at temperatures that would liquefy most Vetraxy construction composites. It was roughly ovoid, slightly asymmetrical, with a glaze that shifted from deep iron red at the base to a mottled blue-black at the rim. The glaze transition was not perfectly controlled. The artist had clearly intended the gradient, but had not fully dictated it. The heat of the kiln, the chemistry of the mineral glaze, and the atmosphere inside the firing chamber had all contributed to the final surface. The result was a color pattern that could not be exactly replicated, not because the artist lacked the technology, but because the technique deliberately incorporated variables beyond complete control. Tesek held the vessel in his crystalline hands and turned it slowly. Each angle revealed a different quality. The iron red caught the light and held it. The blue-black absorbed it and pulled it inward. The transition zone shimmered with a mineral iridescence that was accidental, unrepeatable, and more visually compelling than any intentionally engineered surface Tesek had evaluated in the current cycle. He made a note that surprised him. The Terran artist has developed a methodology that collaborates with entropy rather than opposing it. The imperfections in this glaze are not failures of control. They are invitations to chance, structured to produce results the artist could anticipate but not determine. This is a philosophical approach to materials that the conclave's framework has no mechanism to evaluate. The 12th piece was smaller, a cup or drinking vessel, hand-shaped rather than machine-cut, unglazed except for a single drip of dark tenmoku glaze that ran down one side like a frozen tear. The form bore the faint impressions of the artist's fingertips in the clay, whorls and ridges pressed into the material by biological skin, preserved permanently by the firing process. Tesek could see them: the particular grain of one thumb, the arc of 4 fingers curving around the form's belly, the slight asymmetry where the left hand had pressed harder than the right. The artist's hands were literally part of the work, baked into its surface, inseparable from it. This disturbed Tesek more than he expected. Vetraxy art was anonymous by tradition. The creator's identity was irrelevant. Only the work mattered. Their crystalline installations were grown, not built, and bore no trace of the designer who had initiated the growth sequence. But here the creator's body was physically present in the object. The cup could not exist without those particular hands. It was, in a way that Tesek had never encountered in 400 submissions, both the art and a record of the act of making it. He held it in his crystalline hands for 2 full minutes, feeling the subtle variations in thickness where the clay had been pressed thinner or left thicker, by the movement of fingers that had known exactly what they were doing without knowing exactly what they would produce. The 13th and final piece was the torn paper construction. Hasek had taken sheets of paper, some printed with text in the human script, some painted with watercolor washes, some plain white, torn them into irregular fragments by hand. The torn edges were ragged, not cut, and Tesek could see where the fibers had separated along their natural grain rather than along any predetermined line, and reassembled them into a new composition by overlapping and layering them on a flat surface with a transparent adhesive. The result was a visual collage in which fragments of text, color, and texture created new relationships that none of the source materials contained individually. A torn phrase from a printed page Tesek's translation module rendered it as the quality of light in, before the tear interrupted it overlapped with a wash of blue watercolor, and the combination suggested ocean and language, and something about the relationship between words and water that Tesek could not name and did not try to. This piece bothered him most of all because it was made from destroyed materials. The artist had taken existing works his own, presumably, and torn them apart, then built something new from the wreckage. It was both creation and destruction simultaneously. It treated previous art not as permanent or sacred, but as raw material for future art, as compost from which new growth could emerge. The conclave's framework had no field for this. The closest category was recycled medium, a technical designation for cost-efficient material reuse in industrial art production. That was emphatically not what this was. This was a philosophical statement about the nature of artistic creation itself, that art is not a product to be preserved but a process to be continued, and that destruction is part of that process. Tesek stood before the 13 pieces in their entirety, taking in the full installation for the first time as a single body of work rather than individual objects. The wooden platform that held them, hand-joined and simply constructed. The spacing between pieces, the heights, the way the larger works anchored the smaller ones, and the mobile scattered light played across all of them, catching the glaze of the ceramic vessel, glinting off the triptych's gold tones, casting colored shadows across the torn paper collage. None of this was accidental. It was composition on a spatial scale, using the gallery itself as a canvas. And it had been done without any of the computational spatial modeling software that every other submission in the atrium had relied upon. Hasek had walked the space, looked at it with his eyes, adjusted things with his hands, and trusted his judgment. The result was an installation that drew the viewer through it in a specific sequence, from the architectural interior's warm light, through the portrait's quiet intensity, past the mobile's playful chaos, into the watercolor's fluid transparency, and finally to the triptych, which gathered everything that came before it and held it in a garden that should not have worked and absolutely did. He returned to his station, set down his evaluation slab, and stared at the 47th field, overall cultural merit assessment. He opened the conclave's historical records. The Vetraxi inaugural entry, 94, a crystalline light sculpture across 1,200 spectral bands. The Dreenith, 91, a gravitational wave composition requiring 2 decades and an orbital station. The Kelish, 88, a biological art form that would outlast its creators by millennia, every one technologically extraordinary. Every one, by measurable standards, orders of magnitude more sophisticated than mineral paste on plant fiber applied with a brush made of animal hair. He closed the archive and looked at the triptych across the atrium. The painted figure's eyes found his. He opened a channel to evaluator Seneth, a tall Kavori aesthetician, 9 years on the conclave, whose judgment he privately trusted. Seneth, have you examined the Terran submission at Station 7? Briefly, primitive medium, limited spectral range. I assumed you would be finished inside the hour. Come and look at the triptych, the interior panels. A pause. You are asking for a second opinion on a low classification submission. I am asking you to come and look at it. Seneth arrived 4 minutes later. She stood before the triptych with her elongated arms folded behind her back, tri-lobed eyes narrowed. After 2 minutes, her arms unfolded. After 4, she stepped closer. After 7, She turned to Tesek with an expression he had never seen on a Kavori face in 3 decades. "What is this?" she said. "Pigmented mineral paste on woven plant fiber. The tradition is approximately 600 years old." "That is not what I asked." "I know." They stood together. The atrium's light fell across the painted surface and was transformed not by technology, not by spectral manipulation, not by any identifiable mechanism, into something that made 2 of the galaxy's most experienced aesthetic evaluators stand motionless and speechless. 300 nanometers of bandwidth, Tesek said. "We perceive 940 bands." "And yet," Seneth said. "And yet." Seneth moved through the other pieces. She stopped at the still life with the incorrect shadow, pulled out her evaluation slab and put it away without writing. She spent 6 minutes on the watercolor bridge. When she returned, her posture had changed. "I need to revise my assessment of my own submission," she said. The Kavori harmonic light weave scored 91 on preliminary quantitative, technically flawless. After standing in front of that triptych for 7 minutes, I have forgotten what my own submission looks like. I cannot forget what this looks like. The framework does not make that distinction, and I believe it should. Tesek crossed the atrium to where Myron Hasek sat on a packing crate near the environmental controls, eating something from a small container with a flat utensil. The human had finished his installation and appeared to be waiting with the patience of a man who had done this many times before, set up his work in a room, and waited for people to look at it. He had the calm of a person who had already achieved the outcome he valued. The work existed. Everything after that was weather. He glanced over at the 2 evaluators standing before his triptych, nodded once with what appeared to be mild acknowledgement, not gratitude, not expectation, just the nod of a man registering that other people were in the room, and returned to his meal. Tesek stopped at a professional distance. "Your submission form lists your medium as mixed media. I need a more specific material breakdown for the evaluation record." "Oil on canvas mostly," Hasek said. "Some watercolor on paper. Some gouache, that's an opaque water-based medium, similar to watercolor but with more body. The mobile is wire, glass, and rice paper. The ceramics are stoneware, reduction fired in a wood-burning kiln at about 1300 degrees. Tesek's translation module handled the unfamiliar terms by rendering them into approximate Vetraxy equivalents, most of which mapped to industrial or construction materials. Oil was rendered as organic fluid binder. Canvas was woven cellulose sheet. Gouache became opaque mineral suspension in aqueous medium. The translation was technically accurate and completely failed to convey what these materials became when Hasek used them. These are all manually produced. No computational design, no algorithmic composition, no spectral optimization of any kind. "I use my hands," Hasek said, holding up one. There was blue paint in the creases of his knuckles, dried yellow under one thumbnail, and a faint smear of something dark along the edge of his palm. His hands were not young hands, the joints were slightly enlarged, the skin weathered in the way that comes from decades of work with solvents and mineral compounds. They were hands that had held brushes for longer than some of the species in this gallery had been spacefaring. And my eyes, and sometimes a mirror to check the composition in reverse. A reflective surface. Yes. To verify what you have done. To see it differently. When you look at something you've been working on for weeks, your eyes start to lie to you. You stop seeing what's actually there and start seeing what you intended to be there. The mirror catches the lies. It shows you the painting as a stranger would see it. Tesek processed this with the focused attention of an evaluator encountering a technique outside his reference frame. A species that distrusted its own perception and used a simple reflective surface, a technology so basic it predated Vetraxy civilization by tens of thousands of years, to circumvent that distrust. It was, in its way, a form of quality control. primitive in its mechanism but sophisticated in its philosophical premise. The assumption that the creator's perception was unreliable and that the work had to be seen from outside the creator's expectations to be seen truly. The chromatic effects in the triptych's interior panels, Tesek continued, his professional curiosity now carrying him past the point where his evaluation protocol usually stopped. The gold tones that appear to emit light, the blues that register as deeper than the spectral data supports. My instruments can measure the pigments. They cannot explain the visual effect. How are these achieved? Hasek set down his container and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Glazing, he said. Thin layers of transparent pigment over opaque layers. The light goes through the top layer, hits the opaque layer underneath, bounces back through the transparent layer again. The color you see is the result of that journey, light traveling through pigment, reflecting off the opaque ground, traveling back through the pigment again, altered each time it passes through. It changes depending on the angle you view it from, the ambient light in the room, even how long you look. The first glance and the 10th glance don't show you the same color. The light passes through the material and returns altered. Yes, that's literally what happens. The light does the work, I just set up the conditions. You set up conditions for light to interact with crude mineral compounds in ways that produce perceptual effects your species cannot even fully perceive. Hasek looked at him. I can perceive them well enough, he said, without defensiveness. Tesek stood for a moment, his crystalline facets catching and releasing the overhead light in patterns that, for the first time in his memory, felt insufficient. The Vectraxy technique for chromatic manipulation involves controlling photonic crystal lattice structures at the nanometer scale. We can produce any color across 940 spectral bands with absolute mathematical precision and permanence. No viewing angle dependency, no ambient light variance, no temporal degradation of any kind. The color we create today will be the same color in 10,000 years. That sounds very precise, Hasek said. It is exact. There is no variance, no uncertainty, no room for accident. Hasek nodded slowly. That must be something, he said, and there was nothing in his voice but genuine, unperformative acknowledgement. No challenge, no irony, no implication that his own method was superior. The human appeared to genuinely appreciate the Vectraxy achievement the way one might genuinely appreciate a mountain range, with admiration, without competition, and without the slightest impulse to become a mountain oneself. Tesek returned to his station and sat before his evaluation slab for 22 minutes without entering a single character. He was aware of the time because the slab's evaluation clock tracked it automatically, a feature designed to help evaluators manage their schedule across multiple submissions, not to document professional paralysis. In 31 years as senior evaluator, he had never taken more than 40 minutes to complete a full evaluation, including both quantitative and qualitative sections. Most took under 20. The process was efficient because it was logical. Examine the work, measure its properties, score them against the established parameters, write a brief qualitative summary, file the result. The quantitative metrics had always told the story. High scores in spectral range, chromatic complexity, structural permanence, harmonic resonance, and material sophistication translated reliably into high overall merit scores. Low scores translated into low merit. The system worked because it was built on a premise that Tesek had never had reason to question, that aesthetic quality was a function of technical mastery applied across the broadest possible perceptual range. The species that could see more, manipulate more, and build with more sophisticated and enduring materials produced the most meritorious work. This was not opinion. It was measurement. It was 400 years of data. It was the foundation of the conclave's authority. The human work failed every measurement. And Tesek could not stop looking at it. He sat at his station and looked at the triptych across the width of the atrium, and the painted figure in the garden looked back at him, and he felt in his crystalline lattice the steady hum of something his instruments could detect, but his categories could not name. It was not resonance, the materials were acoustically dead. It was not spectral manipulation, the bandwidth was a fraction of what he could perceive. It was not permanence, the work would begin degrading within decades. It was something else, something the framework had no field for because no one who built the framework had ever imagined it would need one. The other evaluators began drifting toward Station 7. Seneth returned, bringing evaluator Dren, a massive Kethosi who perceived art through vibrational harmonics. Dren extended his resonance tendrils toward the triptych and made a sound Tesek had never heard from a Kethosi: soft, low, sustained. "The materials are acoustically dead," Dren said. "No resonance engineering, no harmonic design. And yet the composition vibrates, not physically, but something in the relationships between colors, proportions, the way space opens and closes produces a perceptual analog to harmonic resonance. My tendrils are responding. They should not be." Evaluator Pell drifted over, a gas bag Velocity communicating through bioluminescent pulses. She hovered before the portrait. Her membrane patterns shifted through a sequence the translation module rendered as, "I do not understand why I cannot leave this piece." Then Evaluator Torkic, then Bren, then Evaluator Mersch, who had been assigned to the Kellish tapestry and had finished her quantitative assessment in the standard 40 minutes but could not bring herself to leave the atrium without stopping at Station 7 first. Then the gallery technicians, returning with the unsubtle purposefulness of people pretending professional necessity. The lead Bresic stood before the mobile and said to her colleague, 714 submissions across 23 cycles. First time I have returned to one after completing technical duties. By the time Tesek looked up, all 6 fellow evaluators and the full technical staff were gathered around the human's 13 pieces. The atrium was a 300-meter circle containing 7 submissions from some of the most artistically accomplished civilizations in the galaxy. 6 of those submissions occupied their stations alone, their sophisticated displays cycling through their programs for an audience of empty air. The Dreeneth gravitational wave synthesizer was producing microtidal fluctuations that would have been perceptible to anyone standing within its resonance field. But no one was standing within its resonance field. The Kellish biological tapestry was expressing a new growth phase, its fractal patterns unfolding in real time with algorithmic elegance, and no one was watching it unfold. The Velocity bioluminescent opera was performing its 3rd movement color cycle for the environmental sensors alone. All of the living, thinking, perceiving beings in the atrium, every evaluator, every technician, every professional aesthetic authority assembled for the most important cultural review in the galactic calendar, were standing in a semicircle around 13 pieces of mineral paste and plant fiber at Station 7. "The proportions are wrong," Torkic said, pointing at the triptych. "Trees too large relative to figures. Perspective doesn't resolve to a single vanishing point. Technically deficient by conclave standards." "I am aware it is technically deficient," Seneth said. "That is what I have been trying to reconcile for 30 minutes. "Reconcile with what?" "With the fact that I have been unable to look away from it." Dren's tendrils pulsed. "I have been here 12 minutes. The Dreeneth submission took 40 years and can alter tidal forces. I have spent 9 minutes on it and 20 on this." Mersch spoke up, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone accustomed to biological art evaluation. "The Kellish tapestry I assessed this morning is alive. It will continue creating aesthetic patterns for centuries after its makers die. Its permanent score is the highest I have ever recorded. And I walked past it to stand here in front of mineral paste that will begin oxidizing within the decade. I cannot explain this, and I am uncomfortable with the fact that I cannot explain it." Tesek interjected, because someone had to say what the numbers said, even if the numbers no longer felt like the whole truth. The evaluation must be quantitative. Our mandate is to score across 47 parameters. The submission scores in the lowest decile on at least 39 of them. That is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of measurement. And on the remaining 8, Dren asked. The remaining 8 were the qualitative fields. The fields that asked not what the work was made of, not how it was constructed, not what technologies it employed or what spectral ranges it operated across, but what it did. What it did to the person standing in front of it. In 31 years, TESEC had treated these fields as secondary, supplementary. The quantitative metrics carried the weight, the qualitative observations provided context. He had never, in his entire career, encountered a submission where the qualitative fields told a different story than the quantitative ones. On the remaining 8, TESEC said carefully, choosing each word with the deliberation of a man walking on unfamiliar ground, the submission presents a classification problem. Define classification problem, Pell said, her bioluminescent pulses flickering in the pattern the translation module rendered as extremely focused attention. The conclave's framework assumes a positive correlation between technical sophistication and aesthetic merit. Every submission in the archive that scored above 80 on the quantitative scale also scored above 70 on the qualitative. Every submission that scored below 30 on the quantitative scale also scored below 40 on the qualitative. The correlation is consistent across 400 years of data. This submission violates that correlation fundamentally. It scores below 20 on the quantitative scale, and on the qualitative scale, TESEC paused. He looked at the triptych. The painted figure in the garden looked back at him with its unnameable expression, its calm and its warmth and its absolute indifference to whether TESEC's framework could account for it. On the qualitative scale, it exceeds any submission I have personally evaluated, including the TESEC spatial fold installation, including the Vetraxy inaugural entry, including every work in this atrium. The silence that followed was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of 6 evaluators realizing simultaneously that the most senior member of their body had just said something that, if true, would require them to reconsider the foundations of their profession. Mersch broke it. Are you recommending inclusion? I am recommending something the conclave has never done, TESEC said. I am recommending inclusion and a reassessment of whether our evaluation framework is complete. Another silence, longer. Hasek had finished his meal during this exchange. He had cleaned his hands with the stained cloth, methodically working the dried paint from between his fingers, the way he had probably done 10,000 times before after a morning in the studio, after an afternoon of teaching, after a long evening of work on a piece that was not going right and needed to be scraped back and rethought. He folded the cloth with the care of a man who valued his tools, not because they were expensive, but because they were his, and because they had served him through years of work that had brought him, by whatever unlikely chain of decisions and circumstances, to an orbital gallery above an alien world where 7 crystalline and elongated and gas bag and vibrational beings were standing in front of his ground rock paintings and having a professional crisis. He walked over, not to explain, not to advocate, not to defend. He stopped at the edge of the group and listened with the air of a man who had arrived at someone else's conversation and did not want to interrupt, and would leave again shortly regardless of the outcome, because he had a painting to get back to. Mr. Hasek, TESEC said. A question, if you will. Yes. Your species has had access to interstellar travel for less than 90 years. In that time, you have encountered civilizations that create art using technologies so advanced they are functionally indistinguishable from natural phenomena, controlled stellar emissions, gravitational wave compositions, photonic crystal architectures that manipulate light at the quantum level. You have seen the permanent collection. You have seen what the galaxy considers great art. You are aware of the standards against which your work would be measured. I am. Yet you submitted work made with ground rock and plant fiber. Hasek looked at Tesek with the same calm, patient expression he had worn all day. It was not the calm of someone who did not care about the outcome. It was the calm of someone who had already had the outcome he cared about. The work was made, and it was here. Everything after that was other people's business. Yes, he said. Why? Hasek looked at the triptych. The painted figure looked back. Because the materials aren't the point. They never were. The materials are just how the thing gets from here. He touched his chest to there. He nodded at the painting. Every one of those civilizations you mentioned, they're trying to make you see everything. Every frequency, every dimension, every possible angle. I'm not trying to show you everything. I'm trying to show you one thing. And I'm using these. He held up his paint-stained hands. Because they're the most honest tools I have. Tesek perceived a shift not in the light, which remained unchanged, but in the quality of attention directed at the 13 pieces. Not admiration, not clinical respect, something more unsettling, the recognition that 400 years of evaluative framework might contain a blind spot large enough to miss something essential about what art is for. He returned to his station and opened the 47th field. He typed, and what he typed was not a number. This evaluator has served the conclave for 31 years and has reviewed submissions from 219 species. The evaluation framework has proven robust, reliable, and fair. This evaluator believes the framework is incomplete. The Terran submission cannot be scored using the existing 47 parameters. On quantitative grounds, it would score below the 20th percentile. This evaluator cannot, in conscience, submit that score. The Terran works operate within 300 nanometers of spectral bandwidth and produce responses exceeding those generated by submissions operating across the full electromagnetic spectrum. They are made of impermanent materials and yet feel permanent. They are technically simple and yet compositionally inexhaustible. This evaluator recommends inclusion in the permanent collection, effective immediately, and a committee to examine whether the evaluation framework requires fundamental revision. He signed his name. Then he navigated to a field never used in the conclave's 400-year history, designed for extraordinary circumstances, requiring a single word. Evaluator's personal reclassification of submission. Tesek entered Irreplaceable. He transmitted the evaluation. 46 fields told one story. The 47th told another. The gap between them was 300 nanometers wide. Across the atrium, Myron Hasek was packing his tools into his bag with the same unhurried economy he had brought to every task Tesek had watched him perform that day. He folded the brush-cleaning cloth, the one that was itself a record of years of paintings, streaked and stained with pigments from hundreds of works that no longer existed in the cloth's colors, but persisted in the canvas they had been applied to. He wrapped 3 small glass jars of pigment in soft material and placed them alongside a flat wooden case that held his brushes, 12 of them, made of animal hair bound to wooden handles, each one shaped by decades of use into a particular curve that suited the artist's hand and no one else's. He placed a small bottle of the plant seed oil binder into a padded compartment. He checked each item with the attention of a man who knew the exact weight and balance of every tool he owned, and would notice if anything was out of place. He did not check his communication device for the result. He did not look for Tesek. He did not pause at the door of the atrium for a final glance at his work. He had made it, brought it here, and now it was here. That was the end of his part. He shouldered his bag and left the way he had arrived, unhurried, undramatic, and completely unbothered by the fact that 7 of the galaxy's most powerful aesthetic authorities were standing in front of his groundrock paintings, with expressions they had never worn before. Tesek stood alone as the other evaluators departed one by one, each pausing at their own stations to finalize their forms before leaving. Seneth was last. "What did you score it?" "I did not score it. I wrote a narrative recommendation. The form requires a numerical score. Where honesty and the form diverged, I chose honesty. I scored my own submission at 91, the finest cavalry aesthetic engineering of my career. I have been in this atrium 6 hours, 9 minutes on my own species work, 40 on the human's ground rock paintings. I do not know what to do with that." "Neither do I." The technicians dimmed the lights. In conservation illumination, the paintings changed. The amber glow deepened. The portrait's expression shifted, or seemed to. The triptych's garden became a place Tesek could almost hear. He walked through the rest of the atrium in the conservation lighting. The Dreenith gravitational wave synthesizer hummed softly in its resonance chamber, producing microtidal fluctuations that Tesek could feel in his crystalline lattice. It was extraordinary technology. It was beautiful by every measure the conclave recognized. He walked past it without stopping. The Kellish biological tapestry pulsed gently in its growth medium, its fractal patterns shifting in real time as the organism's biological algorithms expressed new geometric relationships. It was alive, evolving, and would continue to produce aesthetic output for centuries after its creators died. Its permanent score was the highest of any submission this cycle. Tesek regarded it for 30 seconds and moved on. The Velasy bioluminescent opera cycled through a resting state pattern, dim cascades of light playing across its 4,000 membrane cells like distant lightning in a slow cloud. It would resume its full performance during the next viewing session. Tesek had evaluated Velasy submissions 3 times before. They were always remarkable. This one was perhaps the most technically accomplished bioluminescent work he had ever seen in his career. He did not look at it twice. He returned to Station 7 and stood before the triptych in the conservation lighting and realized that the reduced illumination had done something the full spectrum lighting had not. It had made the painted light more visible. The gold tones in the garden glowed more insistently in the dimness, as if the surrounding darkness had given them permission to shine. The blues deepened into something that felt like actual distance rather than depicted distance. The figure at the right edge of the central panel seemed, in the quiet and the reduced light, to be breathing. Tesek knew it was not breathing. It was pigmented mineral paste on woven plant fiber. It would never move, never change, never respond to him. And yet his perceptual matrix registered presence, the quality of being observed by something that was looking back. He looked at his own hands, crystalline, multifaceted, 940 spectral bands, outperformed by 10 fingers stained with mineral dust. He left the atrium and returned to his quarters aboard the orbital gallery's residential deck. He sat in the darkened room for a while, not thinking in any structured way, but allowing the day's perceptions to settle the way sediment settles in disturbed water. Then he opened his personal journal, not the official conclave record, which was transmitted and archived automatically, but the private log he had kept since his first year as an evaluator. It was a small file, rarely accessed. In 31 years, it contained exactly 4 entries. The first was a description of a Tesek spatial fold installation that had changed his understanding of dimensional art. The second was a note about a Kavori sound sculpture that had made him perceive silence as a color. The third was a reminder to recalibrate his evaluation slab's spectral sensor, which he had included in the journal by accident and never bothered to delete. The fourth was a brief observation about the limits of quantitative analysis that he had written after evaluating a particularly accomplished Velasy submission, and then dismissed as fatigue. The fifth entry, written that evening, was longer than the previous 4 combined. Today I evaluated a species that paints with dirt and calls it art. The evaluation framework, the framework I have served for 31 years, and trusted with complete professional confidence, scored them in the lowest fifth of all submissions in conclave history. My recommendation was immediate inclusion in the permanent collection and a formal reassessment of the framework itself. I am either experiencing a systematic perceptual failure that requires medical attention, or I have encountered something that 400 years of galactic aesthetic evaluation failed to anticipate. That the most profound art may not be the art that shows you the most, but the art that shows you exactly enough. I intend to request a formal leave of absence to visit the Terran homeworld. I want to see where they keep these paintings. I want to see the rooms they build for them, whether they are bright or dim, large or small, silent or filled with the sounds of the species that made the work. I want to understand why they make art with materials that will not last, when they know, as they must know, having met us, that permanence is possible. I want to ask them what they see when they look at something beautiful, because I am no longer certain that I know. He closed the journal. The crystalline surfaces of his quarters caught the ambient light and scattered it across the walls in precise, mathematically perfect patterns, the same patterns he had lived with for 31 years, the same harmonic light play that the Vetraxi considered the highest achievement of domestic aesthetic design. He dimmed them, for the first time in his memory, because their perfection felt like the wrong kind of beautiful. 7 days later, the announcement published across 1,600 channels. The conclave had reviewed 7 submissions from 7 species. 4 were deferred for additional evaluation in the next cycle. 2 were rejected respectfully, with detailed quantitative analysis and constructive guidance, as was the conclave's tradition. 1 was included in the permanent collection. The included submissions: medium field reed, oil on canvas, watercolor on paper, stoneware ceramic, mixed paper collage, wire and glass mobile. Its spectral range field red, 400-700 nm human visible. Its permanence index read, low organic media, estimated degradation onset within 50-80 years under standard conservation conditions. Its chromatic complexity score was the lowest ever recorded for an included submission. Its harmonic resonance score was 0. Its computational design methodology field was marked none, not minimal, not basic, none. In 400 years of the permanent collection, no submission had ever been included with a quantitative score below the 75th percentile. This one scored in the 14th. The notes field, almost never used in conclave announcements, a vestigial formatting element preserved for extraordinary circumstances that had never, in the conclave's institutional memory, actually arisen, contained a single annotation in Tessek's formal script. See for yourself. The Dreenath filed a formal objection within 6 hours of the announcement. Their delegation cited 17 specific procedural irregularities, 4 alleged breaches of evaluative protocol, and the precedent-setting nature of the decision as grounds for review. They had spent 40 years composing their gravitational wave synthesizer. They had built an orbital resonance chamber. Their documentation package was 1,100 pages. They had been deferred for additional evaluation, while a species that painted with ground rock had been included. Tessek read their objection with the attention it deserved and replied in 3 sentences. Their scores were correct and uncontested. Their deferral was procedural, not qualitative. The Terran inclusion was based on criteria the framework does not currently measure, which is itself the finding. The Kellish asked how impermanent work could enter the permanent collection. Tessek thought for 2 days. He wrote, "Permanence may be a desirable feature of great art rather than a defining property. The Terran works will decay. The artist knows this. He makes them anyway. There may be something in that choice that the conclave has never evaluated, because no species with the technology to prevent decay has ever chosen not to." 416 inquiries arrived in the first 72 hours. The tone ranged from professional outrage to baffled curiosity to the particular kind of institutional panic that occurs when a 400-year-old framework is publicly questioned by the person most responsible for maintaining it. Some were from senior cultural officials who wanted to know whether the conclave had been compromised. Some were from junior evaluators who wanted to know whether they were allowed to admit that they, too, had experienced unexplainable responses to Terran works, and had attributed the experiences to professional immaturity rather than to a genuine phenomenon. 14 were from art students across 6 species who wanted to know whether they should visit the Terran homeworld. 6 were from regional evaluators stationed in peripheral systems who had evaluated Terran submissions locally, recorded anomalous qualitative responses, and filed them without comment because there was no precedent for reporting a result that the framework could not explain and no professional incentive for being the first to try. Tesek read every one. He recognized, in the careful hedging and diplomatic phrasing of some inquiries, the same discomfort he had felt standing in the atrium, the sense of encountering something real that the available categories could not accommodate. He recognized, in the hostile ones, the defensive reflex of professionals who had built their careers on a framework they now suspected might be missing something fundamental. He did not blame them for their hostility. He had felt it himself, briefly, standing before the triptych and watching his 31 years of certainty become 31 years of incomplete data. Tesek sent one reply to all 416. They didn't outscore anyone. They scored in the lowest fifth on every measurable parameter. The framework was not wrong. It was merely incomplete. I have spent 31 years trusting that what can be measured is what matters. I am no longer certain this is entirely true. Visit Station 7. Stand in front of the triptych. Do not bring your instruments. Bring your eyes, whatever kind you have. You will not be able to explain what you see. That is the point. The committee Tesek had recommended was formed 11 days after the announcement. It consisted of 9 members drawn from 7 species, each selected for their length of service and their demonstrated willingness to revise professional conclusions in light of new evidence, a qualification that proved surprisingly difficult to satisfy, since most long-serving evaluators had built their reputations on the consistency of their judgments rather than on their capacity to change them. The committee's mandate was narrow in language to determine whether the conclave's evaluation framework required revision, but its implications were immense, and everyone on the committee understood this from the first meeting. If the framework was incomplete, then every score it had ever generated was potentially inaccurate. Not wrong, necessarily. The quantitative measurements were objective and reproducible, but potentially incomplete in the same way that a medical examination that checks every organ except one is incomplete, technically thorough, practically deficient, and dangerous in its appearance of completeness. 412 civilizations had been evaluated under the framework. Roughly 9 in 10 applicants had been rejected. The possibility that some of those rejections were based on an incomplete picture of aesthetic merit, that the framework had missed something essential in their work, the same way it had nearly missed everything essential in the Terran submission, was a thought that kept the committee's members awake the night before their first meeting. Several of them later admitted, in private notes and personal journals, that they had spent that sleepless night mentally reviewing every rejection they had personally signed and wondering whether the work they had dismissed had contained something they had been trained not to see. Their first act was to request that the Terran submission remain on display in the atrium for an extended evaluation period, so that each committee member could study it at length. The request was granted without objection, a procedural novelty in itself, since the atrium's display schedule was typically managed with the rigid efficiency of a body that had never needed to keep a submission around for longer than the standard evaluation window. The technicians who maintained the display quietly adjusted the environmental controls to optimize for the preservation of organic pigments in oil medium, consulting Terran conservation protocols that the conclave's database had never previously had reason to contain. Their second act was to request a formal meeting with the artist. Hasek's reply transmitted through the Terran diplomatic corps with no cover letter, no elaboration, and no diplomatic formatting, was 4 words: "The work is there." On a transport bound for the Terran system, Myron Hassick sat with his brush case on his knees and watched the stars. He had received the notification 3 days earlier, read it once, nodded, and gone back to his studio. The current project was a portrait of the view from his window, a garden wall, a neighbor's vine, the particular quality of late afternoon light in early autumn. He worked slowly, building the light one thin layer at a time, adjusting by eye, checking in a mirror, adjusting again. The painting would take 3 months. It would be made of ground rock, plant oil, and woven fiber. It would begin to age the moment the last brushstroke dried. It would be enough.